Hello. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, wherever you are when you're watching this video, or whenever you are when you're watching this video. My name's Rubes. How are you? Sorry about the lighting. It's a little bit bright on one side. I've got the sun peering in that side. I want to get a bit of sunshine because it's friggin' cold. I'm in Australia, in southeast Queensland, and I'm currently experiencing winter, and we normally get pretty chilly in winter time. But the last few days, it's been cold enough to freeze the balls off a brass monkey, folks. What I want to talk about is the word Indigenous. Now, as you would all probably be aware, there's a lot of words in our vernacular that have lost their original meaning. Okay, and Indigenous is one of those words. Now, the word Indigenous is an adjective, and it's a Latin term that means born or originating in a particular place. So you look up here, gene, give birth, beget. Indu, Old Latin, in, within. Genea, Latin, to beget, produce. Indigenia, sprung from the land, native. Pardon me. Inborn. Indigenous, born in a country, native. And what we have now, which is this one here, Indigenous, 1640s, born or originating in a particular place. Born or originating in a particular place. Okay, so going by that definition, folks, everyone on this earth is indigenous to wherever you were born. Now, for me, that's Australia. And for everyone else who was born in Australia, no matter what racial makeup that you have in your hereditary line, it doesn't matter because you were born and you originated in a particular place. And I've got here from the National Library of Australia some archives from a high school magazine in 1962, and they went to Alice Springs and Ayers Rock. And in this little article from this high school magazine, I think it was the Tweed River High, they're talking about Alice Springs and McDonnell Ranges, and not once in there is the word Indigenous used. The only thing I can find there was I saw very few natives, for most I cared for in missions. It's interestingly, whoever wrote this article wrote, Aboriginal, inverted commas, is a word not used in the territory. Okay. So, but there's Indigenous isn't in there. So that's 1962. I think I find the word Indigenous sort of started creeping in 1967 and around then, and we will deal with that in a minute. So let's go back to this. Indigenous, born in the 1640s, born or originating in a particular place. So let's see what's been saying about it now. I did a bit of a search, and I just typed the word Indigenous in. And there it is there. And scroll down a bit. And what does Indigenous mean in Australia? What is it different from the Latin term, is it? The Australian government defines Indigenous Australians as people who are Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander descent, identify as being of Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander origin, and are accepted in the communities in which they live or have lived. Well, why wouldn't you be accepted in the community no matter what your race was? If you lived in that community, you should be accepted in it as long as you did the right thing. So they're picking out on race now, folks. See that? Whereas before, over here, the proper meaning of Indigenous, Latin term in the 1640s, born or originating in a particular place. So this one here, I'll show you where that link is. I think it's that one. There it is there. It's the Australian Government, Australian Institute of Health and Welfare. The Australian Government, oh, there it is there, I'll let you read it. In most data collections, a person is considered to be Indigenous if they identified themselves or were identified by another household member as being of Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander origin. But if we go to Canada, self-identify as Aboriginal, they call it there, including First Nation. Where have we heard that one before? Well, they got it from Canada, folks. Do you wish to identify as an Aboriginal person in Canada, such as First Nation, Métis, or Inuit? Any client may self-identify as being an Aboriginal person, regardless of legal status under the Indian Act. No proof of ancestry or belonging to a band is necessary. What if you're an AC/DC? Can Angus get in? Why is it important to ask the Aboriginal self-identifying basic question? See, it's all there, folks, and I'll put all these links in the video description. Training for Aboriginal self-identification question. Well, that's a good one. You need to train to do that. So going back to what is under the Indigenous identification process in Australia, it's very similar to Canada, folks, and they got it from there. Recent events, and this is very interesting. This is a government website. The Black Lives Matter protests and the COVID-19 pandemic have highlighted inequities in health and justice between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australians. That's just racist right there, straight in that statement. The Black Lives Matter protests, what that is about American, African Americans. It has nothing to do with Australia, nothing. And they're creating a division by saying between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australians. Well, we've already ascertained, folks, that Indigenous means born or originating in a particular place. I was born in Brisbane, Queensland, Australia. And that's where I'm Indigenous to this area, Southeast Queensland. Come on. Race doesn't come into it, and they're making it in race, okay? Well, here we go there. Most data collections, a person is considered to be Indigenous if they identified themselves as one. Well, I identify myself as Indigenous Australian, folks, because race doesn't come into it. We've already ascertained that. Let's see what some other organisations say about Indigenous people. Let's go to the World Bank. Indigenous peoples are distinct social and cultural groups that share collective ancestral ties to the lands and natural resources where they live. They slipped that one in there just to make you think that Indigenous people own everything. There they go again. The land and natural resources on which they depend are inextricably linked to their identities, as well as their physical and spiritual well-being. I mean, you can read it all there, folks. And this is interesting. Their statistics differ quite differently with some of these corporations. So there are an estimated 460 million Indigenous peoples worldwide. And although they make up to 6% of the global population, they account for about 19% of the extreme poor. For them, here we go. Much of the land occupied by Indigenous peoples is under customary ownership, yet many governments recognise only a fraction of this land as formally or legally belonging to the Indigenous people. Hello, The Voice. Again, I'll put all these links down below so you can see more, guys. And there's that word, sustainable development goals. The World Bank works with Indigenous peoples and governments to ensure that broader developments programs reflect the voices and aspirations of Indigenous peoples. This is from the World Bank. So, well, they're not really working with Indigenous people because they didn't come to me, and I'm Indigenous to Australia. They're definitely working with the governments. And if you think they're going to work with the Aboriginal people, they're not. They're going to screw them over. There it is there, folks. United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, UN DRIP. Okay, so that's that one. And then we go over to Amnesty. They're saying 476 million Indigenous people around the world. Yep, that's what the other one said. They said it's 5%. The other one said 6%. Indigenous people are often marginalised. Well, we are, because you're not including us in your statistics there, Amnesty. And this is a good one. Indigenous people can be identified according to certain characteristics. Most importantly, they self-identify as Indigenous peoples. And there it is there, UNDRIP. And they always include those resources in there, folks, because that's what they want to come and do, is rape them. And here's another one, United Nations Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues. Now, they're saying there's only 370 million Indigenous people in the world. And they're, again, talking about self-identification down there. According to the UN, the most fruitful approach is to identify rather than define Indigenous populations. This is based on the fundamental criterion of self-identification. Well, I'm self-identifying as Indigenous to Australia because I was born here, and I go by the Latin term for Indigenous, which means born or originating from a particular place that comes from the 1640s, from all these different other terms, originating with this one, gene, give birth, beget. That's your mum. You come from your mum. Everybody comes from their mum. That's where you're Indigenous to. All right, guys. I think I've just about covered everything, but I wanted to leave you with a video of a good friend of ours. And his name is Lieutenant Colonel Kevin Loffrey, retired from the Australian Army. He gives a great presentation about what I was just talking about, and I'll leave you with that. And I'm also going to make another video soon that gets more in depth about why we need to stop this voice to Parliament thing, because it's not really going to benefit the Indigenous people, okay? It's going to screw over everyone. It's a corporate takeover. They're coming in here. They want to rape the land and say, you can't do anything. We won't be able to go anywhere. Look at Mount Warning, you know. So it's really important that this word Indigenous is being hijacked and bastardised, right? It's not being used for its true meaning. And this is one word we need to be used for its true meaning, because they're saying there's only 360 to 470 million Indigenous people in the world. Well, hang on a second. According to the Latin proper meaning of Indigenous, you're leaving out all of us. You're leaving out, what was it, 94 to 95% of the populations, and that's discriminatory, folks. Now, there's a word that hasn't changed its meaning, has it?
Indigenous. The word comes from the Latin and it applies to anybody who is born and lives in this land. It has nothing to do with one's racial makeup. Modern day Aborigines are not native Aborigines, and I stress that because you'll see what's happened. This has been as sly as a toilet rodent. All earlier legislation refers and applies to native Aborigines, and I'll show you that in a moment. But this was slyly forgotten and the word Indigenous inserted. The present day Aborigines are not native Aborigines, but instead are persons of mixed race like everybody else. I mentioned I had my DNA examined, and I'm actually, which was one of the earliest people in the British Isles. Then came the Celts. My brother's definitely a Celt because he suffers from hemochromatosis, which is unique to the Celts. I got Russian in me, I got Viking in me, I've got some Spanish in me, thanks to the Cervantes side of the family, and that then leads me into Africa, where I've got Negro in me. But wait for it, I'm actually part American Indian. And I've got some Mongolian in me. How the hell did that happen? Well, Blair Thomas came from the goldfields in California, and he was a half-caste, and he came over here and settled, and he's in my mother's line. And so I've got American Indian in me. I could actually go to America and say, oh, I'm an American Indian. So I'm a bit pale, I'd say, call me paleface. Everybody who is part Aborigine is no different to us. And we ought to view it as that. We're all Australians. And this, I'm passionate about this. I'm all one mob. Yeah. The next part of this psychological warfare are the words traditional owners. It's like a dog trying to get onto the living room couch. It's at the corner and it's going to be a traditional owner, and eventually it gets on the couch, not the owner. You know, First Nations, that's crap. They had no writing, they couldn't talk to each other, there was no codification of law, there was no standard culture. People think, oh, there was a standard, there wasn't, because they couldn't communicate. They basically, their culture evolved to suit the conditions in which they lived. The idea that there are somehow nations here is crap, and it's been borrowed from the Canadians. Borrowed from the Canadians. Borrowed from the Canadians. Okay, the reason they're trying to do this is it implies a hereditary right to ownership, a greater legitimacy of ownership than is logically warranted, making all other Australians of different racial groups inferior. Making all other Australians of different racial groups inferior. Making all other Australians of different racial groups inferior. That's the game. This is really important. In 1901, the Attorney General, who was then Alfred Deakin, and I've read Alfred Deakin's biography, as I have Andrew Fisher and Edmund Barton. I was very interested in how the hell we actually came to be the way we are. But he gave a legal opinion in 1901. His legal advice was that half-castes were not Aboriginal natives. In other words, all the people who are running around telling you that they're Aborigines, they're not, according to Alfred Deakin, 1901. Only Aboriginal natives. Now, what was an Aboriginal native? In 1962, the Parliament passed an act to give Aboriginal natives of Australia the right to enroll as electors of the Commonwealth and to provide for certain offences related thereto. E.g., if they decided they wanted to vote, then if they don't vote or if they get bribed to vote, then they're committing an offence. That's all that was saying. But Section 159 of the Principal Act is amended by adding at the end of the words, or with the free exercise by an Aboriginal native of Australia of his choice whether or not to enrol as an elector. Now, even that was biased in that we don't get an option. We're told voting's compulsory, sunshine, get to it. But they said, look, the fact of the matter is a lot of these Aboriginal natives can't speak English, they're hard to locate, they live a nomadic lifestyle, they're totally dependent on the Commonwealth for sustenance, so it's not reasonable to enforce this. We're just saying, look, if you want to, you can. And by the way, anybody, regardless of the racial makeup, if they left the reservation or the mission and they took on a normal job, for example, they may have married a European lady or whatever, as happened, then they were classed as being Australians. They had all the rights of any other citizen. The racial makeup didn't come into it. And yet, if you listen to the left or listen to the communists now, you could be easily forgiven for thinking, oh, we didn't allow Aborigines to vote until 1962. That's rubbish. Okay, 1967, the referendum had multiple proposals. People think, you ask people what it was, and some people tell you it gave the right to vote to Aborigines and things like that. It didn't. It was in the reckoning of numbers of the Commonwealth, of all of the states of the other Commonwealth, Aboriginal natives shall not be counted. Now that's what 127 said initially, and that was done in 1900. And why was that provision in the Constitution of 1900? Well, there were serious practical difficulties in counting Aboriginal natives in these days. They did then say Aboriginal natives were dispersed and nomadic. Communications in inland Australia were poor and frequently non-existent. Today, the situation is very different and counting is now practicable. Now that was actually in the blurb that came out. You know, when you have a referendum, you get the for and the against argument. That is taken directly for the for argument. Okay, so now you won't, if you go onto Google and you go even into government websites, you will find they don't show that at all. They have a totally malign, malignant version of what happened. What the 1967 referendum did, it entrenched racism into the Australian Constitution. They slipped in a Trojan horse. So we have got in our Constitution, right at this moment, a clause which says that the federal government can make laws specifically for a particular race. And Whitlam said, "You Purity," he was a Fabian, by the way. That's a really, really bad piece of offal. So Whitlam changed the definition of native Aborigine, which, by the way, was a person who was living a traditional lifestyle on a mission or a reserve, not the people who were out, according to Deacon, not the people who were living in our society. They were just Australians. Whitlam changed it to native Aborigine to anybody who was regarded as being an Aborigine, and the word Indigenous crept into our lexicon, and this gave rise to a racially biased welfare system and a $30+ billion industry called the Aboriginal industry.